In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the subsurface scattering shader found within MentalRay. Alright, so here is the scene example that we're going to be working with for this lesson. Now, if we take a render at what we have right now, you'll see that it's pretty straightforward, just the normal object, really nothing special in this scene. We do have two lights in here, though. One is a little bit brighter light, and then the other one is a little bit less intense. So what we need to do is come in, and let's add a new material onto this. So let's start by adding in a material. So let's find an empty shader port, or an empty material slot here, and let's add in a subsurface shader. And we'll use maybe just this fast material, this one right down here. Alright, so let's drag that onto our object, and let's just take a render at what we have now. Okay, you can see this renders out really fast, really quickly, and straight out of the box, though, it really doesn't quite give us the effect that we are looking for. Really, we want to try to get something that is a little bit soft, a little bit more of a kind of a wax kind of feel to it. So what we need to do is come in to some of these different attributes and explore these. So right now what we have is the overall diffuse color, which is kind of the underlying color of this. Right now it's set to white, and if we were to set the weight of this all the way up to 1, we should pretty much get a full effect on this. What this number is, it's actually a multiplier, just like what we had talked about in one of our earlier lessons. So a value of 1 means that it uses the entire value that's reported back. Anything lower than 1 means it only uses some kind of a partial value. If it's set to 0, that means it uses none of that diffuse color value that's reported back. So what we want to try to do is find an ideal mixture of the surface color, the front scattering color, and this back scattering color. Alright, now a lot of times what I prefer to do is adjust these different attributes one at a time. So what I try to do is take the weight of the diffuse and the front scatter, set both of those to 0, and then I can set the weight of this back scatter all the way up to 1, so it reports the entire value back. And now I have the freedom to come in and adjust this how I choose. So let's take a quick render. Now you can see right away that really we're not getting anything out of this back scattering. Okay, still pretty much just comes out black. Now what we need to do is adjust the radius and the depth that light is able to penetrate through this object. Now these values right here are very important because they do correspond to the units here in our scene. Now the units that we have right now can be found if we look right next to this keyframe button. We see a little feature that says grid equals 10. So what that means is for each grid box that we see here, that's actually corresponding to 10 units. Now with that in mind, if we look at what this value is, it's less than 0.4, so we're getting a very tiny amount of penetration of light through this surface. So if we really want to get this going, let's really start to increase this. Let's start with a value of something like 3 and 3, which should be a distance of about this much. Actually, we'd probably want to take this up a little bit higher because there is going to be a little bit of fall off as we go through this. So let's render and see what that does for us. Alright, and now you can start to see that there is a little bit of light penetration coming through here. So some of these thinner surfaces are now letting some of this light come through. Alright, so let's raise this weight, or rather this radius, up a little bit higher. Let's go to something like 10 and 10. Again, because we do have a type of fall off on this, really the light is not going a full 5 units through. By the time it reaches 5 units, it's already fallen off to a value of 0, or a energy level of 0. Alright, so as we start to increase this, again, now you can start to see some of this lighter color that is passing even a little bit deeper now through this surface. Now, one thing that we do have is this is very heavily based on the intensity of your lights. So if you have a very strong intensity light, you're going to get obviously a much deeper and better penetration through this. So if I were to take this light, and this is going to be my main energy casting light, And if we were to take this maybe up to a value of 1.5 and re-render this, we should now get a little bit stronger light effect, or the penetration of this light through here, and you can see we do get a little bit more. But if you look closely, we actually do have a little bit of an error right here, and that is right in this area. The light is actually coming from this direction. Now what we should be seeing is really no light penetration coming through this area, because the light should be stopped by this solid opaque object. So what we need to do is, for the main light that's going to be responsible for passing this light through an object, you want to make sure that it does have shadows enabled. And now, let's see what that does for us. And now we should see this light is being blocked by this opaque object, and now we get something that is much, much closer to what we would need. Alright, so now let's come back and start to make some minor adjustments to this shader. So let's go back to our subsurface shader, and we can maybe start by giving this a little bit lighter color. You can see right now we do have a little bit of light penetration here, but it really is overall very dark. So we can start by giving this front scatter color something a little bit brighter, maybe a little bit more vibrant. Re-render that. There we go, and now this light scattering effect becomes a little bit easier to see. Now once I have this set the way I want, I'll set this weight to 0, and now I can start to tune the front scatter color. So I'll set its weight up to 1, re-render. Now this is going to be the light that actually doesn't necessarily pass all the way through the object, but is able to partially pass through and then come back toward the camera. So this is going to be light that is primarily going to be coming from this other light, bounce off, and then come back. So again, with this, probably want a little bit lower, or actually a little bit higher radius on this. So let's start with maybe something along the lines of 7 for the radius, so that way this light's able to pass a little bit deeper into the surface and come back out. Alright, very nice, and you can start to see this effect coming back at us now. Alright, so once we have this set, again, set that to 0, and just take a look at our diffuse color with its weight set all the way up to 1. So this is kind of our little balancing act here. We want to get maybe just a little bit of diffuse in here, and maybe a little bit of front scatter. Ideally, what you want to try to do is make sure that the diffuse weight and this front scatter weight, when they add together, don't go past 1. Now that's really not a set in stone rule, but ideally, if you want to get 100% of the color values back, you would try to set those to 1. Now this backscatter weight, we can set it however we want. And when we render all of these together, now you can start to see this subsurface scattering effect, and we get kind of this nice waxy, kind of jade type of appearance. Alright, and we also do have some additional controls in here for things like the specular color and the amount of shininess that this object does have. Also, things like the light map's gamma curve, and if we look a little bit further down, we also have things like the scatter bias. So what this does, again, it's a 0 to 1 value, so it kind of helps us to determine whether or not the final result leans more toward the subsurface scattering effect or more toward the diffuse lighting effect. Depending on what this value is set to, when it's set all the way to 1, we should get a result that is completely diffuse. There we go, at least as far as the front scattering is concerned. As we set this to a much lower value, we should now start to see a little bit more of the front scattering color kind of becoming apparent. Alright. So I'll just go ahead and set this back to the way it was. Oops, I actually was adjusting the wrong one. We want to adjust the scatter bias, not the scale conversion. There we go. Now we start to see a little bit more of that subsurface scattering effect. Alright, now the scale conversion, I always try to leave this at a value of 1. Now what that means is, when it's set to a value of 1, we are using whatever values that we see here in the viewport. Alright, so in our case, we're penetrating 10 units deep with the light, and that corresponds to 10 units here in world space. Now, if we start to take this and adjust this value, we can basically create the appearance of an object that is larger or smaller. So what that means, kind of in a nutshell, is if we start to take this scale conversion factor. It's kind of a backwards number. It seems like a backwards number at first glance. The higher this number, as we start to take this up to a value of, let's say, 2, what that's going to do is treat this object as if it's double its current size. And so what that means is light is actually going to penetrate much less deep into it. There we go. You can start to see a little bit of that effect here. So as we start to maybe increase this a little bit higher and re-render this, we should now start to get even a little bit less light penetration. You can see that is exactly what we get. So rather than trying to monkey around with this, I always try to leave that at a value of 1. Again, as if we start to take this to an even lower value, now we start to get a lot of light coming through. So much so that now we really start to introduce a lot of noise. So really just try to save yourself a little bit of headache and keep this value at 1 whenever possible. Alright, so that's a look at this subsurface scattering shader that's built into Mental Ray. And you can see very quickly it is able to get us some really, really nice results.